This is Dr. Chris's Radio Horror Show at 91.3 FM, WCAW, review with comic book writer Matt Hawkins. Thank you for coming on the show with us, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yes. I actually discovered your work a long time ago before I ever realized it on a book called Blood Legacy, The Story of Ryan.
Oh, yeah. That was based on my sister's novels.
It's been a long time since I've read those. What were those about? It was rather interesting, but I wasn't able to ever complete it though.
It was the novel. We did a 4-issue miniseries, which was essentially just kind of a version of the first novel, but it was sort of a truncated version. And I sort of adapted her novel, but she's written like I think 7 or 8 of those novels that are all available on Kindle and in bookstores and stuff like that. It's in essence about a group of vampires. It was pre-Twilight and pre sort of all that stuff. And but my sister was sort of obsessed with how all that stuff worked and how it could have been possible that it was real. And so she developed these characters and did a lot of research. And my sister is this nutty smart person. She's got like 7 or 8 degrees in astrophysics, and she went to Annapolis and all these crazy things. And so she writes with a flair that I think is kind of interesting and appeals to I think smarter people. I don't mean to be dissing anyone that doesn't like it, because if they don't like it, doesn't mean they're dumb. I'm just saying a lot of her readers tend to be savvier. I talk to them and we have really interesting conversations about it. So and that actually her novels is really kind of what inspired me to want to write at all.
Was that really the first thing you worked on, like kind of the beginning of your career?
No, I started at Extreme Studios, Rob Liefeld's division of Image Comics I started in April of '93. Started as an assistant editor and as a marketing person primarily. And the first books I worked on that were mine as an editor were like Battlestar Galactica, Evangeline, War Child, and there's a couple others. I'm trying to remember what they were. But the first comic I ever wrote was a book called Lady Pendragon. And
wow.
I think the first issue came out in 1995. As a one-shot through Rob's division, Maximum Press, which was at Extreme Studios. There were two. There was Extreme, and then there was Maximum Press. Maximum Press was his company that was outside of Image, and Extreme Studios was his company that was inside of Image. So we had 2 different branches. And Eric Stevenson ran the Extreme branch, and I ran the Maximum branch. And then when Rob left, when Extreme was sort of kicked out of Image, I stayed with Rob, and we then eventually formed Awesome Comics with Jeff Loeb, and did that. And I wrote a book called Six String Samurai, which is now based on the movie there. And then when Awesome Comics folded after the first year, I wrote Lady Pendragon through Image Comics, and I did 2 years of that, 18 issues. Did another book called Alley Cat. And then in sometime in spring of '98, Top Cow hired me, and I took over their publishing, and I've been there ever since, 22 years. And I've written hundreds of books since then. I mean, Think Tank, After 99, Postal, Symmetry. I wrote some Witchblade. I did a book called Swing.
Going back to Image Comics in 1993, so you were there from like the beginning almost, because they started, what, 93, 92?
I think the company's first comic came out in October of '92. I don't know how much prior to that it was actually in existence. I think it was sort of those guys. It did exist, but I don't think there were actually like offices or anything like that. So I was there within the first 6 months to a year for sure.
That was the what was that? Youngblood, or was that Spawn #1? That was the
Young #1 was the first Image comic.
Okay, then Spawn, right?
I don't actually remember the order. It might have been Wildcats. I think Tim's book came out before Todd's. And then I shouldn't say. I don't remember the ordering.
But that sounded interesting that you were there from almost, I guess maybe the beginning of the Image revolution, as they called it. I mean, the big change of the comic book landscape, changed forever when that happened.
Yeah, I mean, Top Cow sort of pioneered computer coloring. I mean, it hadn't been done. I was at Extreme when it happened, but Top Cow started computer coloring Cyberforce. Brian Haberlin, who was the sort of one of the starters at Top Cow, he sort of developed and built out a lot of the coloring systems that everyone uses now. So he doesn't get a lot of credit for that, but Brian and a couple other guys sort of founded and developed what is the norm now. And Top Cow's color on the slicker paper, sort of the higher production values. Rob and those guys wanted to really push the boundaries in terms of splash pages, breaking panels, and they were just able to do all these things they always wanted to do as artists that the editorial staffs at Marvel and DC wouldn't let them do. And they just had a field day, and they had a lot of fun with it. And those early days were exciting, and it's so different from now, because the business now is it's a numbers game. It's like it really is. Everything's budgeted and forecast, and you kind of make sure you're selling, and it's all sort of more. It's become much more of a business for me now than it was back then. Back then, it was sort of this wild, crazy adventure. I mean, we were doing books that I look back at now, and I'm like, oh my god, that was a horrible comic, but we'd sell like 800,000 copies of it, And that first issue of Lady Pendragon sold 700,000 copies. So the first comic I ever wrote was the best-selling comic I've ever had. And it's weird because it's just a function of the time, and I think all those early Image books, there are people that still have cases and the cases of unopened to those somewhere in their warehouses, and because we see some of those and they pop up from time to time, and I've seen cases of some of those books sold on eBay for like $10. So I think there were a lot of speculation going on in those early days, so there was a lot of people that were buying these books and they weren't even reading them. They're like they were thinking these were the first books from the new Marvel Comics, and while I think that actually has proven to be true, I mean the difference is there were so few. There's so few of the original Marvel Comics still in print because of the paper drives and the wars and all these sort of things, and people didn't know to save them. Part of the reason why so many Golden Age and Silver Age books are worth so much money is because there's so few copies that are pristine or even reasonably pristine. But almost everything post 1985, I would venture a guess that almost half of those print runs of everything ever made is still in a bag and board somewhere, probably in decent condition, So, and there's that whole supply and demand curve. And I think a lot of the speculators in the early days of Image, and it wasn't just Image, it was the Death of Superman, it was X-Men #1 launches, it was people were speculating on absolutely everything, and the numbers were just kind of insane. And it made a lot of people rich, which was fun, but it also ruined a lot of people, because I think one of those things is you give a lot of young guys a lot of money. And, you've seen all the horror stories of the NFL and the NBA with these young rookie guys that get all this money, and they don't know how to handle it because they don't have sort of the experience and the maturity to deal with that and what happens. So there were guys that were making, $1 million a year that, 10 years later, they're penniless. Rob gets a bad rap, but Rob's actually quite well off. He's done very well with his money, and, I know his Deadpool deal, he still gets a significant creator royalty on that for creating that. And I don't know the exact numbers because I'm not privy to it. I don't talk to him that often anymore. But I know for a fact he's made multiple millions of dollars off of just Deadpool in the last 5 to 10 years. And he didn't do anything. He just created it 30 years ago and had a creator contract, had a very smart contract, and that's all she said. Whether or not you like Rob or you like his work, to me there's really no question that he had a integral, significant impact on the industry. And he was one of the few guys that was actually pretty smart with his money. I mean, the company itself, Extreme Studios, bled a lot of money. I mean, we in the early days, because there were not a lot of people that knew what they were doing in terms of business.
That's what I was talking about, though. Like, he was the young guy, and Extreme Studios was the company that bled a lot of money, kind of like NFL players bleeding their money out through just the dumbest things they get themselves involved with sometimes.
Yeah, but Rob, he lost money on the company, I think, and eventually when it got to the point, and the smart thing that he did is he just shut it down for a while. When it got to the point where it would affect, I think, his sort of personal nest egg, he just decided to do something else. And, Awesome Comics was not, he did not fund it, and that was other people, and so there's, Rob's a lot smarter than people give him credit for.
What were you doing before you joined Image Comics?
I was in college, working at a bank, paying my way through school. People get kind of mad when they hear my origin story or how I got hired into comics, because I didn't actually read comics at all. My nephew was a comic book fan. He was 13 or 14 at the time, and he asked me if I would take him to a signing that Rob Liefeld was doing at Mile High Comics for the opening of that store in early '93, and I didn't know who Rob Liefeld was. So he asked me if I'd take him, and I did. And the signing was like at 3:00 on the afternoon on a weekday or something like that. So I remember I took the time off and went down there, and my nephew's like, we need to go really early. There's going to be a long line. And I'm like, it's 3 o'clock. We'll just go at 3 o'clock. So we get there at 3 o'clock, and there was like 1,000 people in line.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh my God, what is this? There's like 1,000 people in line for this group. And it was not just Rob. It was Marat Michaels, Dan Frege, Eric Stevenson. It was Richard Horry, Norm Ratman. I think that's the crew that was there. And they were all basically signing an outdoor thing, like a little tent, where they were just running people through like the parking lot of Mile High Comics. And I stood in line behind 3 guys that are in the industry today. And these are 3 young artists, John Sabal, Marla Alquiza, and Cedric Nocon. These 3 guys they all knew each other. They were standing in the line in front. I think it was those 3 guys. I might have one of those guys wrong. But they were in the line in front of me. I didn't know anything about comics. They had their portfolios. And so for 3 hours while I waited in this line with my nephew, they were talking about comics in the industry. And so for about the first hour, I wasn't really talking to them. I was just kind of overhearing what they were saying. And then I started chatting with them a little bit. And so for the next 2 hours, I got kind of an education on who Liefeld was, what Image Comics was, what the industry was. I mean, I knew what Marvel and DC were at that point, but I hadn't really heard of any of the other companies. And so by the time I had gotten to the front of the line, I had this sort of 3-hour indoctrination into what their perception of the industry was and what was going on. And when we got to the front of the line and went in this little tent thing, there were these guys. There were all these young guys that they were all wearing black leather Extreme Studios jackets, and there were a bunch of really cute girls with them. And I just walked in, and I had been working at a bank, and if you've ever done retail banking as a teller, it is one of the worst jobs on the planet. And I was doing that to pay my way through school. So when I got to the front of the line, there were these guys, and there were these cute girls, and I was working this job that I hated.
Me too, right now.
And they just looked like they're having, yeah?
Yeah, me too, right now.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just saying I relate to your story because I'm in a swimming boat circling the waters right now with a comic book that the first issue is completed, but I want all 3 issues to be completed before I start thinking about printing and publishing, and I'm swimming in boats of jobs that I hate. And the only thing I'm doing right now that's anything successful is an audiobook series for a goth chick over in England. I'm going to be her narrator. And Linda's husband's Sunstone book, I've turned that into a pretty successful audio series.
Cool. Very cool. I think I've heard that. I didn't know that was you guys. I got to the front of this line. The guys right in front of me, Jonathan Sabal, showed Rob his art, and Rob said, "I think it's great. You're hired. Why don't you jump back to the table and meet some of the guys?" And I was just like, it was so weird because if that hadn't happened, I would not have done I was literally the next person, and I just saw this guy get hired on the spot, and I almost half jokingly said as I walked up to Rob, I'm like, "Hey, I'm not an artist, but are you looking for anybody to do anything else?" And that's all I said. And he's like, "Yeah, we need someone to do, letters or letters pages and press releases. Is that something you could do?" So I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Hey, why don't you go to Eric Stevenson?" I'm like, "Okay." So I went over and talked to Eric Stevenson for about 15 minutes. He gave me his card. I didn't know that Eric had only worked there for like a month. I didn't really know the history of this. And so Eric gave me his card and said, "Hey, why don't you come down to the office tomorrow and we'll talk." And I didn't know at the time that Rob had basically just told him, "We should hire this guy. If he sucks, we can just fire him later." I mean, that's what he told Eric. And I was coming down essentially to be hired, but I didn't know that. And so the next day I went down to the office. I was working at a bank, so I was wearing a suit. And I went in, and there's all these guys in shorts and T-shirts, and they were looking at me in my suit, and they left me in the lobby for a couple hours. And this was pre-cell phone, and I was on my lunch, and I was starting to panic because I'm like, I'm going to be late back to work, and they're going to, And so I was thinking of all these reasons I could lie to them about why I was late, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally Eric came out and said, "Hey, why don't you come on in and talk to me?" And I went to UCLA, and so I'd been through UCLA's like job center where they taught you how to interview, they taught you how to, resumes, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually, when I started sitting there talking to Eric, he wasn't really interviewing, he wasn't really asking me any questions. So I had sort of been trained through the Career Center that if you have a bad interviewer, just tell them about yourself. And so I just started telling him all this stuff about myself and my life, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't know that Eric was just waiting for Rob to come in the office. And that so Eric thought I was this pretentious douchebag in a suit who's, bragging about his life, et cetera, which is funny now. And I just saw Eric yesterday, and we actually laughed about some of this stuff, 27 years later or whatever it is. Then Rob came in and said, "Well, we decided to hire you." And I'm like, "What?" I didn't even know. And the next question out of his mouth was like, "How much money do you need to make?" And I was like, it was so bizarre because I'd been through like Career Center interviews, and I'd done like a whole series of interviews through UCLA, and this was the weirdest thing I'd ever dealt with in my life. And I just did some quick math in my head. I knew I was making $30,000 a year at that time working at the bank, so thinking that he would counter back at 35 or 40, And he's like, "Oh, okay, that's fine." And I didn't know at the time that they were paying some of those guys $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. You know what I mean? I mean, some of these guys were getting insane salaries in the early days because they were making so much money. They didn't really have a concept of what they needed to pay people. And there was no one that worked there that had worked anywhere else, really. Rob had worked at Marvel Comics, but he only as a freelancer. He'd never had his own business, really. And and his sister was there running the finance. And I don't remember what she had done before that, but she wasn't in finance, I don't think. And so I told him I had to give a 2 weeks notice to the bank because that's what you do. He seemed really annoyed by that. But what I did is I worked at the bank, and then I came and worked. And I literally had read a book on how to write a press release the night before, because right after the signing, I went to Crown Books, I recall, and bought a book literally called How to Write a Press Release. And so I wrote a press release about the Mile High signing before, and so when I was sitting there, I had handed it to him. I said, "This is just to show you what I can do. This is the press release I would have sent out to the local media for your signing yesterday." And so he looked at it and he's like, "Great." I started there, and it's 27 years later.
Now I understand what you mean by when you say that people are upset by how you broke into comic books.
And the first comic book, here's the crazy thing. The first comic book that I read that wasn't like when I was a little kid, my mom gave me like Archie digests, and you'd read some of these things on cars or planes or whatever.
Right.
But I'd never really read like a regular comic. The first comic I ever read was, and I remember talking to Eric Stevenson at the time, and I'm like, I don't really, I get the appeal of the art, but I don't really like these stories. And Eric's like, "Here, go read." He gave me a copy of Watchmen, and I went and sat and read Watchmen. And I'd never heard of Watchmen, and I'd never heard Alan Moore either. I was blown away by Watchmen. I was like, wow, this is. So then I read everything Alan Moore did at that time, and I started reading, some other writers that I really got interested in. And I'm like, this is not just a kiddie art form. There's stuff that's for adults. There's some really interesting stuff. And then I found Dave Cockrum and Chris Claremont's God Loves, Man Kills, that X-Men graphic novel they did, and I fell in love with that. And so since then, I've read tens of thousands of comics since then, and I feel like I would say I'm an expert in the medium, because I've been doing this for so long. But yeah, no, my start was very strange.
And that's what makes such a compelling story about your work in comic books. I had no idea, that you had started out that early in Image. I knew you as a Top Cow guy mostly, which means an Image guy, because Top Cow and Image are the Image owns Top Cow. Image still owns Top Cow, right? I'm not wrong, right?
Top Cow is part of Image Comics, but Image doesn't own anything, actually.
Oh, okay.
Mark Espley owns Top Cow.
Gotcha. Well, hey, what's funny is that, and I know you worked on Witchblade a little bit, we're going to my podcast, the Dead TV podcast, which talks about canceled television series one episode at a time. We're currently covering the Addams Family. The next show we're doing when we end the Addams Family in October, early November, is going to be Witchblade, the series from the early 2000s.
The first season of that show was fantastic.
I loved the first season of the show. I thought the second season was okay. I wish you can listen to our podcast to discuss why that show was not renewed, and we'll get into it, and we'll be talking about the facts. That's, again, what makes your story, your career so kind of compelling, because like I just said, I had no idea you've been involved with Image Comics for so long. I just knew you as, like, a writer of comic books, but I didn't realize you had gotten that involved, like, lettering and editing and stuff like that so early on from such, like, humble beginnings and stuff. It's kind of like who was the guy who worked at Marvel when he was, like, 14 years old? Is that Jim Shooter?
Jim Shooter, right?
Yeah, that right there is just like, what? 14? And you're working on what book?
Paul Levitz did that at DC, where he was 14 writing books. So it's Paul Levitz and Jim Shooter, I believe, were the guys that were super young working at those companies.
Right, or that guy who's owned the Batman rights forever since he was like a kid or something.
Michael Uslan?
Yeah. Now he's been involved with every single major Batman project. He sold it back, but still, they pretty much that allowed him to get a job at DC Comics until the end of his days. What was the first character that you created? What was the first book that you created?
That was Lady Pendragon. And that was just because I was obsessed with that John Borman's Excalibur movie from 1981. I always loved that movie. And I always wondered what would have happened at the end of that movie if Percival had not throwing the sword back to the lady in the lake. And so I created that story. It's like, Guinevere in that story was in the convent, and I did some research. And this is the crazy thing about research then and research now. That research then took me months. I had to track down obscure books from, stores in England, and, I actually flew to Glastonbury and took a bunch of photos for reference for the artist. And, it was months and months and months of research to write that comic. And, today that would take me about 2 days on the internet. I wouldn't need to buy anything. So it's, the world is so interesting now compared to the way it was. Cause sometimes I think about that. To be honest, the research was fun for me back then. I actually really quite enjoy the research. So I try to do some of that stuff now, but it's just so easy just to take photos from the internet and find the information you need. And, so Lady Pendragon was the first character I ever created. And, the one shot I did at, Maximum Press, the company I was the editor-in-chief for, it was all set in the past. It literally was that story. It was after that Battle of Camland, what would happen if the sword didn't return to the Lady of the Lake? And since Guinevere was in the convent and the Catholic Church in those days used to go and clean up the battlefields and take the bodies to consecrate them, I had her with the battlefield and I had the sword call to her, and so she got the sword in the past. That was the original story. When I relaunched it as part of Image Comics in '98, I actually developed a modern day story where there was this woman named Jennifer Drake. She was a historical fiction writer, and she famously said that she essentially writes what comes to her in her dreams. And so at the same time, there was a story on where the Pathfinder mission to Mars they had found a sword in a stone on the surface of Mars, in a collapsed ring of stones. And so the governments had brought all this material back, and they found these sort of ancient Latin, texts written on rock. And when they started transcribing and translating some of this stuff, they realized that the words that were on some of these rocks were word for word some of the words from this woman's historical fiction. So they tracked her down, brought her to, the NSA where they had the sword they brought back from Mars. And, when she came in contact with the sword called to her, and she pulled the sword from the stone in the present, and that caused magic to return to the earth. And I was playing with the idea that magic and electromagnetism are two sides of the same thing. And so when magic returned to the earth, electromagnetic energy sort of dissipated, so planes fell from the sky, the power went out worldwide, and all the modern sort of technology and stuff we use just didn't work anymore. And so it became sort of this weird sort of post-apocalyptic situation, which was fun. And I did 18 issues, and it sold really well. And that book and the touring I did at conventions was how Top Cow decided they wanted to hire me. And when Mark and Brad Foxhoven at the time offered me the job, I jumped at it because I wanted to work with guys like Mike Turner and Dave Finch, and I knew Witchblade was a top-tier book, and it was nice to have some health benefits and stuff like that too, So I came because being a freelancer on your own is difficult. So it's kind of nice to have a home.
I understand that. I'm just like doing rando comic book scripts for artists here and there, and then it's like I've never seen the book.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to do it on your own, and you work out of your house, and you don't have always a lot of contact with people, and you feel sort of isolated. And I always tell people that want to get into comics, if you want to be a writer or an artist and you're a freelancer, you better be prepared for extended periods of isolation. And if you can't handle that, then it's not really a good career for you. Yeah, so I did that book, and I did another book called Alley Cat. I did another book called Blue through Image Central, and then Top Cow hired me, and I've been there ever since. And I've written hundreds of books for Top Cow.
Postal. Yes. I read the first volume of Postal. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. I wrote Postal as a TV pilot. I was working with my agents and my managers about a decade ago, and I spec'd a pilot script for that, and we took it out and tried to sell it, and no one was interested. And the general feedback we got was that no one is interested in a lead character that has Asperger's. And at the time, that Monk show, I think, was on the air, and I'm like, what are you talking about? There's a TV show with a character that has Asperger's on the air right now. And but it's hard to argue with these people, so I just kind of said, okay, whatever. My manager, Rick Jacobs, who I still work with, who actually works for Skybound now, he said, why don't you just do this as a comic, and we'll try to take it back out again whenever it's done. So I put it on the back burner, and 5-6 years later, I was talking to Brian Hill, and I gave him the pilot, and I said, look, would you work with this? Because I was working on a number of things, didn't have time to do another project. I said, would you work with me on this project? The first graphic novel I want to do is just my pilot. I would just like literally to translate the pilot. So the first graphic novel is literally the pilot TV script I wrote a decade ago. And then the second volume I was working with Brian where we were kind of going back and forth. The third one was mostly him. And then on the fourth one, I took my name off as a writer because I realized at that point I wasn't doing anything. And so the fourth and fifth and sixth volumes he wrote.
And that's how you got connected with Linda Sedgwick?
Linda I met through her husband. Stepan was, let's see, how did I meet? Stepan was, I found through Tyler Kirkham. Tyler Kirkham, who's an artist at Marvel now, was doing a book called The Gift with a guy named Raven Gregory, which is sort of this indie comic that was coming out. And he was spending a lot of money on Wizard ads, et cetera, et cetera. And I met Tyler at the conventions, and so we hired Tyler. And Tyler was using Stepan Sedgwick as a colorist. And I'd never met Linda at that point or didn't even know she existed. So we started working with Stepan as Tyler's colorist for a period of time. And then as that happened, Stepan kept saying, you know, I can actually draw too. I'm interested in doing artwork, et cetera, et cetera. So he sent us some work. He did a couple things. I can't remember what the first stuff he did. But then he did a very long run on Witchblade. He did like 50 issues of Witchblade.
Right.
And then,
that's how I discovered him.
Right. So he did that with Ron Mars. And then at the end of that, he did Aphrodite 9 with me, and we did 20-some issues of Aphrodite 9. Somewhere in the middle of that Aphrodite 9 run is when he started doing Sunstone as a webcomic. He did it as a free webcomic. I was reading it, and I thought it was cute, but it was not anything that Top Cow would historically have ever even considered for publication. And we had tried for a long time to sort of distance ourselves from the quote-unquote bad girl books of the 90s. So he kept asking me if we'd put it in print. He's like, I have a big fan following for this Project Sunstone. Would you guys put it out in print? And I said no for a really long time because of the material, the content. And I was kind of scared of it a little bit. And but finally I relented and we agreed to put it out. And it has now become Top Cow's best-selling original graphic novel series ever.
That's amazing.
And now we have a whole line of books to coordinate with it.
Yeah, like yours, which is Swing.
Yeah, Swing, which I co-write with my wife, which is Linda. Linda and I worked on. Linda was doing some coloring work for us. The first book I think I did with Linda was called Wildfire. She and I did because she was sending over some art. I saw some of her webcomics. She and I did this just this one-shot graphic novel called Wildfire that she and I did together. And then we worked on Tales of Honor together, which is based on the Honor Harrington license of novels. So, after Tales of Honor, and Stepan had, at that point, was doing the book, trying to remember what, Sunstone was being in print and was doing really well. She had a comic called Bloodstain that she was doing as a web comic as well.
Right.
So we did the same thing and put that out. And then, so that's how I sort of started working with them. And then when she was done, she'd done 2 or 3 volumes of Bloodstain, and I asked her if she'd be interested in doing Swing with me because I said, look, Sunstone is a sex-positive slice-of-life book about a sort of sexual subculture that is not really well understood, and so when we started putting Sunstone out, I would have people come up to the booth and they would talk to me, and I would have Sunstone over here, and then to the right I would have Think Tank Postal, Aphrodite 9, all this other stuff, and these people would come up, and a lot of them were women. There were a lot of middle-aged and really loved this book. It's so great, and I kind of got educated on the S&M community because a lot of those people really appreciated the book because it was a sex positive look at something that they did as a lifestyle choice, and they were used to being shamed for it. And people were very open with me about it. They're like, you don't understand how much we appreciate this. We hate 50 Shades of Grey, and it's just 50 Shades of Grey makes our community look bad. This makes our community look good. And they were used to, and a lot of times people had done like fan fiction or stuff that was in the S&M community, but a lot of time it was sort of perverted. It sort of presented it as a perverse thing, as some sort of like a dysfunction. And so when he did it this way, and it was sort of a celebration of it in this positive way, that community embraced that book so well that they kept coming up and they were asking, like, look, do you have anything else like this? We would really like to support these kind of books. So I started doing a little bit of research, and I live in Los Angeles, and I could only find 2 S&M clubs in LA, and I'd gone to visit them because I was just curious, and after reading Sedgwick's books, then I started googling around sex subcultures, and the swinging came up, and I hadn't even really considered that, and then I looked, and there were 7 swinger clubs in LA, 7, and I'm like, okay, there's 2 S&M clubs, but there's 7 swinger clubs. I said, that's interesting. So maybe there's a lot more. There's a bigger community here. Maybe we can replicate that success by doing something similar. So I started interviewing a bunch of people, and my wife and I went to a bunch of these clubs just to check them out. And we started meeting people and talking to people about this lifestyle. And so we sat down and wrote the book. And it was literally the hardest thing I've ever written. I mean, I had such a difficult time writing that book I used to kind of look down my nose at romance, and now I don't, because it's, you know, if you look at Aphrodite 9, that book exists because Cedric told me he wanted to draw dragons fighting spaceships. And that's why we created that book, and I wrote that whole story for him. It was specifically so he could draw dragons dogfighting with spaceships. And but Swing was this whole other thing, and I couldn't master it. You know, and a lot of the little tricks I learned in storytelling, like where you sort of just jump into the center of it, you know, and you jump into the action, and then you kind of go back, and sometimes you flash back or whatever, you explain some of the backstory, but you sort of started off with a bang, you know. I mean, that's what I'm used to in comics and science fiction. But so I did that with this. And then Cedric's like, nah, you got to show the build up. We got to care about these people before this. So I had to do so many drafts of that comic, and I still wasn't getting it. And then one day Cedric sends me this email. He's like, hey, have you heard of this movie Up? This Pixar movie Up? And I'm like, yeah, of course. I have kids. And he's like, go watch the first 10 minutes of this several times, and then sit down and try to write it again. And it was the best advice I got, because I did that. I watched that. I remember the story about the old man and his wife and how they couldn't have a kid, how she died, and that's why he didn't want to move. But I didn't really study it. You know, it's kind of, I'd watched it with my kids. It kind of came and went out of my head. But when I sat there and just looked and watched that, and I think it's only 7 minutes long, actually, that whole story, it is a powerful, emotional, evocative story about this guy and his relationship with his wife and her death, and explains so much, and you just care about that character so much by the time that's done, that it really struck me. Because if you look at the Swing graphic novel, the original story I wrote started on page 40. Like, page 40 was page 1 I had written. So page 40 to about page 60 was the original 20 pages I wrote. It's still the same story, but we added the first 39, 40 pages, which was sort of explaining how they met, their relationship, you know, all the troubles they got to with how she got pregnant in college, and you know, then she didn't really have very many sexual partners, and she'd only ever been with this guy. And in today's world, a woman with only one sexual partner in her life is kind of weird for most people to even wrap their mind around. And so we created this whole thing, and you know, and it was fun. Once I sort of developed that and figured it out and tried to figure out what are the sort of, you know, and my wife and I had a lot of conversations about this. You know, if we did this, what would be what would be the bad, what would be the good, what would be the emotional hurdles, how would we be able to make this work? You know, I started studying what compersion was. I'd never even heard that term before. That was such a foreign concept to my thought process, raised in the Baptist church by my evangelical parents. You know, I mean, I was taught until 18 or so that you weren't supposed to have sex outside of marriage, period. And interestingly, I lost my faith in Christianity when I did the research for Lady Pendragon. That's a whole other story. But no, because I'd never heard of the Gnostic Gospels. I'd never heard of a lot of this stuff because it just never been explored. So when I started doing all this research, I found all this other stuff, and I was a regular attendee of this church, and I started asking my pastor all these questions. And after about 6 months of my questions, he got annoyed at me. He did, and he kind of told me off. And it was such a weird thing because he's like, you just have to take it on faith, Matt, and you need to stop asking all these questions. And that rubbed me so wrong. I never went to church again. I think I've been in 2 churches since then, and that was 22 years ago, and they were both for one was a wedding, one was a funeral. Back to the subjects of it all. Yeah, so Swing was a challenge, and it was interesting to me because it's so important to convey dialogue and emotion, and the dialogue becomes so much more important in a story like that. Like a slice of life, it really is. You have to make them care about the person, and then you have to make them care about what happens to them. And that's true to any storytelling, but I think in a lot of science fiction, and I realized going back and rereading a lot of my earlier work, you use visuals and insane scenery and just really cool, clever technological ideas and things and concepts as a crutch almost, to where you use that to make it interesting. I think that's part of why there's so many of these newer science fiction movies I kind of look at, like a lot of the new Star Wars movies. They're just not as good to me because you just don't care as much about some of these characters, you know, and they're so quickly brushed over it. It's interesting to watch.
When I was reading Swing, and I read the beginning of the preface before the main story, I was thinking, because I saw pictures of you and your wife, whatever, the characters in Swing were kind of like modeled after you and your wife.
Yes, that was intentional.
Was it a challenge to get her to, like, for research purposes, to go to these like fetish clubs?
No, she was way more into it than I was. No, she quite enjoyed it.
Have you ever read John Everson's novel Neverwhere?
I don't know. I don't think so.
John Everson is a horror author, and he's a Bram Stoker award-winning horror author. And he wrote this novel called Neverwhere about a couple that are kind of bored with their sex life, so they decide to start going to fetish clubs, sex clubs, and the wife starts getting more involved in it than the husband to the point that she gets addicted to it. And he starts investigating the club that she's going to, and they are, like, killing people in this club. And he talked about, like, him and his wife, first it was him, then his wife started coming. To going to these fetish clubs to do research for his novel.
Wow, that's kind of scary.
But you read this part of the book or whatever, and it's like something Clive Barker would write in a Hellraiser movie. It is, it's very sexually driven, but incredibly horrifying too.
Right. Well, that would be horrifying. I mean, and I think that's exactly the opposite of what we've tried to do with these books. We've tried to make them sex positive. We tried to create them where, we even in Swing, in the second volume of Swing, which should be out in the next couple of months, there are scenarios in there where you see some of the downsides. I mean, we try to present these things warts and all, and kind of, this is what happens, but these are the hang-ups, because we don't want to present it as something that's just, because honestly, that kind of stuff I don't think is for most people, you know what I mean? And so you sort of try to do it and present it in a way, and to where the people that obviously wouldn't be into swinging, they can read it and enjoy it and see it as an alternative lifestyle that some people can do, but it's not evil. You know what I mean? And so we didn't really go down sort of any of the real serious fetish stuff. There's all kinds of weird, and I'm judging. That's me being judgmental. But there's all kinds of things like that are so on the fringe. I don't know that they're very healthy. At the end of the day, for swinging and for S&M, if it's done by two consensual people and they're both enjoying it, or if it's with swinging, if it's 4 people, 3 people, whatever, then who's it hurting really?
Nobody. I mean, as long as it's like you're not enforcing it on other people, then yeah.
Yeah, and to me, it's all about, and it's kind of changed my opinion on a lot of things because, like I said, I was raised in the Bible Belt. And was sort of rose up in the church, and it took me a long time to get rid of that sort of indoctrination out of my head, because I would think of things as being wrong, and then people would challenge me like, well, why is that wrong? If you think that if these two couples meet up once a month and have sex with each other, and they're all 4 into it, and it's not causing anyone any problems, then why is that wrong? And it took me a long time to sort of wrap my head around that, and it's interesting because morality is severely impacted by your upbringing and your sort of your religious beliefs. And in many cases, I think these religious beliefs create a lot of emotional problems for people that are unnecessary because for many people, there's a lot of people that really are not into monogamy, and people that cheat. I mean, the number of people that cheat on their spouses is insane. It is a huge statistic. And so if you can scratch that itch and everyone has fun and it's not causing anyone any relationship problems, and then what's wrong with it? So we did present it, I think, warts and all, but it's kind of one of those things where the research was really interesting because it really made me take a look at some stuff. And because I also, when we did Sugar, which is the other one, that was about the idea of a sugar daddy, sugar baby relationship and how that would work. I sort of in my head was trying to write it as a modern day Pretty Woman, but at the same time, I took out the fact that she had done it. So this was this girl's first time. She'd never done it before. They'd actually gotten involved before it was suggested, and she was having all these financial problems, and the guy left her some money after they hooked up because he saw that she needed it and she had all these bills, and her immediate response to him was, I'm not a hooker, But then as they continued to sort of be involved and they developed some sort of a win-win relationship, it sort of worked out. But, it was, I wanted to do something with that sort of subculture. I don't think we'll probably do a second volume of Sugar. I'm working on Swing 2, which should be done in the next week or two, but Swing Volume 3 is on the schedule, and as soon as I get the plot out, we'll get the art going.
Yeah, I was just about to ask when that was going to happen, so I'm looking forward to that, definitely. And as well as whatever other project that you got coming up that you can't talk about, but hopefully it's through Top Cow and it's fantastic.
Well, I can talk about it. I'm doing The Darkness. I'm working on The Darkness with Tom Grenberg, and we've been working on that for a while. We're getting multiple issues in the can. It's a relaunch of The Darkness. It does take place in sort of the canon of the previous, so it's not one of those complete relaunch kind of things with a new character or something like that. Like Witchblade. So, The Darkness and the Witchblade have always been sort of top-down tentpole properties, and we're looking to sort of get back to that. I think we we did Witchblade for so long, like almost 15, 18, 20 years or whatever that was, that we wanted to give it a break. And then when Eric Stevenson sort of brought in the idea of Caitlin Kittredge doing a arc with a different artist and kind of a completely different take, we did that. And now we're sort of trying to figure out what to do with Witchblade again once the Caitlin Kittredge story comes to an end, and we're sort of playing with that idea. But I'm working on The Darkness, and Sarah Pizzini is in that book, and so is Jackie Estacado.
Oh, God, thank God, because I'm a big fan of Caitlin. I read her, was some type of witch horror book that she did for Vertigo.
It's called The Coffin.
Yes, Coffin Hill.
Yeah, Coffin Hill, yeah.
Yeah. Was that Vertigo or Image?
I think it was Vertigo. It was not an Image book.
Okay, Image. Vertigo. Okay. So I was so excited when they announced they were relaunching Witchblade. I was like, okay, so it's not Sarah Pizzini. That's fine, because Witchblade can be worn by anybody. And then I started reading it, and I was like, I am not enjoying this as much as I thought I was going to. And by issue 6, I dropped it. So I'm looking forward to The Darkness, if it's going to be like the way you're saying it's going to be.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, one of the things that we've been able to do with The Darkness and working with Grinberg was sort of a Silvestri pick. I knew him from his Sandman work in the early 90s. But he had been doing sort of this Frank Frazetta kind of style, because he was doing. There were these Frank Frazetta books that were coming out. Some of them came out through Image, like Death Dealer. They're based on characters that were fleshed out, and the stories written about famous paintings Frank had done. And Tom had been doing some of this work, and it was just this beautiful, amazing work. So, and Mark just really liked it. So when we talked about The Darkness and artists, he suggested I work with Tom, and we started working, and we're well into the first issue at this point. I don't think it'll probably launch next summer. I would guess at the earliest next summer, maybe even next fall. A year from now, a year to a year and a half from now, because we're going to get several issues. Like Postal right now, Deliverance, which the first issue comes out next week. We actually have 8 completed issues. We historically have had such problems at Image with timeliness and stuff like that we've just sort of really worked hard to put multiple issues in the can before we launch these things, so that timeliness becomes less of a challenge.
Give away your social media stuff and where people can find your work. And
on Facebook, if you just put Matt Hawkins in there, or if you Google Facebook Matt Hawkins Top Cow, you'll find me. The handle is actually Self-Loathing Narcissist. But you can find me through Top Cow's Facebook. Like Top Cow has Top Cow on Twitter. Top Cow, just Top Cow Instagram. And I'm connected to most of those, and you can find me through all of those. But I use Twitter, I use Instagram, and I use Facebook pretty regularly to promote my stuff.
If you have one piece of great advice for people trying to, I want to say break into the comic book industry, because that is an incredibly difficult question, but if they want to do something with comics in general, what would you say to them? I
would say don't do superheroes. Write something different. The problem with most fans that want to become writers or artists in the industry is, artists is different, but for writers, it's because the thing with an artist is just get trained, learn your craft, draw every day, and there's so many books out there on how to be a comic artist that learn your craft, learn your anatomy, and just do it, draw it. It takes years to work out all the errors of your work, but and I can tell if an artist is workable in seconds. You know what I mean? The second I look at a guy's portfolio, I know whether I would work with him or not. It usually takes me about 5 seconds. But in a writer is a whole different issue. If you want to write comics, I always tell people, I say, find something in your life that's unique or interesting. If you're a fireman, write about fire stories that are freaking cool and interesting. Write a story about some characters that are doing stuff that you know about, something you know about that most people don't. Maybe some weird thing that's in your background, your history. Write from experience. Write some sort of interesting science fiction story, something. We get so many pitches of superheroes, and the truth is we don't even really do superheroes at Top Cow. So when people pitch us superheroes, I don't even really look at them. But when I do look at them, and when people talk to me at conventions, most of them are knockoffs of existing superheroes. I can't tell you how many different versions of Batman and Superman I've seen in my lifetime. Thousands. And I told these guys, I said, look, maybe you should try something different. And they even say, this is kind of my take on Batman. I'm like, well, why do we need that? When you're Mark Miller and you want to do a book called Nemesis and you want to do your take on Batman and do it as a create your own thing, and you're already, a well-known writer, you can do that. But if you're trying to break in, a lot of editors kind of roll their eyes at that kind of stuff. And the other thing I would say is write stories. If that's the way to get in, is by do self-publishing webcomics and maybe doing a Kickstarter and to monetize it at some point. I really am a believer of webcomics now, and I've seen so many people break into the industry that way. They'll do a webcomic, small following, they'll build a few Twitter followers, and then a year or two later, they'll try to monetize it. They'll say, hey, you 200 people that read my webcomic, will you help me put this book in print? I'm going to do a Kickstarter. And most of them do, because they appreciate it and it's not too expensive. And then people like me who look at Kickstarter on a regular basis, I scroll through and I see some guy or girl doing a project I've never heard of, and they've raised $15,000, and that piques my interest because as a publisher from my business hat, I'm always looking to mitigate my risk. And so I know if I put Mark Waid plus this artist on a project, I know approximately what that's going to sell for me. But if it's somebody that has no track record, that's very hard. And we're very risk averse, especially with the publishing numbers that are today. It's just much easier for us to hire a guy like a Mark Waid or a Dan Jurgens or whoever, and we can hire these guys. Us hiring them is a much higher likelihood than us hiring a random person we've never heard of. But if you build up a following and do sort of these things where there's Patreons, and you can show to the people looking at it that there is some sort of mitigation risk, it's more likely to take a chance. And the other thing I tell people on both on writing and art submissions is always do them based on existing characters. And the reason for that is unless you're pitching image to create your own project, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people do, and then I'm looking at the portfolio and I'm trying to give them some tips and feedbacks. And then sometimes the response is, oh, that's just my character, man. That's how my character works. And I'm like, and then I kind of roll my eyes and you know, they don't know that I roll my eyes, but I do roll my eyes in my head. And then I just kind of, you know, it never even makes it back to the office. When people are doing a story about a Superman or a Wonder Woman or a character that anyone knows, it doesn't even need to be our characters. But if you're submitting a story as a sample of, hey, this is my writing sample, I can read it and tell pretty quickly, okay, this person tells an interesting Batman story, therefore they should be able to tell an interesting Witchblade story. You know, I mean, maybe not, but at least in my head, there's a much likelier chance. The other thing I tell people about webcomics, and the reason why webcomics are so powerful today, there's a pretty good chance, at least in the back of my mind, there's a chance that I might enjoy it. You know what I mean? Because it's like a finished comic. Someone's trying to entertain me, and I'm trying to read it. It doesn't feel quite as much like work, whereas people that send me submissions to their scripts, anytime, I don't care who writes it. If someone sends me a script, even if it's someone that I'm paid to write me a script, it feels like work to me to read it. You know what I mean? And it's just, and plus it's effort, you know, and we're all busy people. And, so if you can shorthand something to make it easier for the people on the other end. And here's the dirty little secret of editors. I share this all the time. Everyone that reads these things or looks at portfolio, what we're looking for, we want to find stuff we can publish. But when we're looking and going through so many of these things, we're looking for a reason to stop reading it. And I can't tell you how often people give me a reason to stop reading it. You know, and if it's just something stupid, if it's really bad formatting. I got a pitch from a guy last year, and he center justified everything in Word. Why are you doing it this way? He's like, that's just the way I write, man. I'm like, dude, I'm not going to read this. Send it back to me left-footed. He never did. I'm like, screw you then. You know, and it just, you gotta make it easy for the person on the other end of the line, and that's why I also say less is more. You're better off sending a 3 or 4 page script sample with maybe a 1-page synopsis than you are sending your 1,000-page dissertation about this comic book idea. I get all the time people drop off just insanely long, like almost looks like a screenplay of their comic ideas and what they want to do, or people will email you stuff and it's 35 megs and it's just words. That's not my job to read your. My job, I write stuff, I publish stuff, I work with the people I already work with. We don't actually need to hire new writers. We don't need hire new writers ever. And most Marvel and DC and those guys too, because, you know, the one thing I tell people, professional writers in comics that do this full time, there's only 300 or 400 of us in the United States. And there's 800 people that play in the NBA? You know, so how many people shooting hoops on a high school actually think they have a legitimate chance of being in the NBA? They might, but so few actually make it. And I can't tell you how many times people are just arrogant and they're kind of rude and they feel a little entitled about it. And it's sort of frustrating. And it continues sort of the sports analogy. You know, the average sports career is what, maybe 5-10 years? You know, how long has Mark Waid, Kurt Busiek, and some of these guys been writing comics? Decades. 40, 50 years? Mm-hmm. I've been writing comics for 25 years now. And I'm still writing comics, and I write 4 or 5 a month. You know, so there's not a lot of opportunity. It's sad, but it's just sort of the reality.
You're 100% correct. Yeah, there's just, you know, it is a tough industry to crack unless you kind of crack it yourself.
Yeah.
You need to, and a lot of people, you know, like Marvel and DC are not looking for talent. They will find you if they want you. People don't understand that. It's just like, listen, they might have a portfolio thing at a convention, which is fine, because that's literally what thir're doing. I mean, Dan, whatever his name is, the guy who runs DC Comics or whatever, he did the one at Boston Comic-Con recently, you know, show me your portfolio, you know, make an appointment like on the website for the con or whatever, we want to see your portfolio, we want to talk to you, you know, and that's what they'll do or whatever. They'll do it at San Diego Comic-Con coming up, but if they want you, they'll find you. You know what I mean? They'll look for you on your social media platform and be like, hey, you draw Spider-Man pretty well. What would you do with a one-shot? You know?
Yep.
And or backup story in some book. We'll give you a backup story to get you started. And but like independent comic book companies are almost the same thing. To crack the industry, you're gonna have to crack it yourself with your own work.
Yeah, guys, these guys that do, they really are. A lot of them self-publish. I mean, a lot of these guys, like Jeff Smith with Bone. Some of these guys, Terry Smith with Strange in Paradise. They sort of self-publish. They do their own thing, and then people seek them out.
Well, hey, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show with us to give us some insight into the comic book industry, especially editing, as well as a lot about, what the early days of Image Comics were like and what you're currently working on. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and it's good chatting, man.
Yes, absolutely.